Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So today we are going to start talking about the process of meiosis. So when we talked cell division in the last section, right, we talked about three major reasons that cells might go and divide and make more cells. And we talked about mitosis in us as humans being there for growth and repair, right? If I need to get bigger, I can't just make my cell bigger forever because of that surface area to volume efficiency, um, moving things in and out, right? That efficiency decreases as that cell gets bigger. Or I just need to replace them, right? Something has damaged them. And so those are the two major reasons that we go through mitosis in humans. The other major reason that cells make more cells is for reproduction. Now, when we talk about asexual reproduction, like the bacteria we talked about, the hydra, the planaria, the yeast, right? Those guys are all asexually reproducing, so they're making clones of themselves. They are making genetic copies. And so they can go through reproduction via mitosis as well. When we look at sexually reproducing organisms like us as humans, we are now going to join two cells to ultimately become that offspring. And so we're not going to be able to use mitosis because now I've got two cells coming together. And so we're going to need to create a subset of cells that allows for that union to occur during fertilization and doesn't end up exponentially causing our chromosome numbers to increase forever. And that's where meiosis is going to come in. So when we look at your body, right, multicellular organisms like us as humans, we've got two major categories that we can separate your body cells into. We can talk about these somatic cells, or what you would typically associate with as body cells. So muscle cells, neurons, skin cells, pretty much any cell you can think about in your body is probably a somatic cell. The other category then is a very specialized small subset of cells that exists in our body, and those are your gametes or your sex cells. So pretty much anything that isn't an egg or a sperm falls into that somatic cell category. All right. But those gametes then are what is going to be the major focus here for us with meiosis, because those are the cells that get produced via meiosis and then come back together via fertilization to make those offspring. So if you're a female, biologically, you produce eggs, and if you are male, then you produce sperm. So meiosis is really going to become a big deal in sexually reproducing organisms, right? Because now I'm going to bring together that egg and that sperm and produce a zygote, all right, which is basically just a fertilized egg. That zygote then will go through rounds of mitosis to ultimately produce an embryo, to a fetus, to a baby, and then you continue to go through mitosis as you become a functional adult. Now, there's two major terms on this slide that we need to make sure we understand. And that's this idea of a diploid cell versus a haploid cell. All right. So when I talk diploid cells, if we look at your body and we look at any of your somatic cells, so if I pull out a muscle cell or I pull out a neuron or I pull out a skin cell, those cells all are diploid cells. And what that means is that you have a set of genetic information that came from your mother. You also, in that same cell, have the same type of information, another set of chromosomes that come from your father. So what we talk about here are, in terms of numbers, right? We talk about your diploid number here. So in humans, we say you have 46 chromosomes. Really, it's 23 pairs. All right, so a set of that 23 chromosomes came from your mother, 23 chromosomes came from your dad, and they are pairs with each other. So you have two chromosome 1s, you have two chromosome 2s, you have two chromosome 3s, and your mother gave you one set of those, your father gave you the other. That's where we're talking about these two sets, this diploid number. If I go and I look at my haploid cells in humans, those are our gametes. These get created via meiosis, and these guys are 23 chromosomes, so they only have a single set. Okay, now a point I want to make here is when you look at this, we actually designate this with these sort of mathematical symbols here, right? Because if I go to another species, that diploid and haploid number will be different, right? If I go take a look at a corn plant, their diploid and haploid numbers are different. If I go and take a look at your family dog, their chromosome numbers will be different. So different numbers of chromosomes in different species. The numbers that are here, the 46 and the 23, are our numbers. Those are the numbers that I will expect you to know um, because we're talking about us as humans. But be on the understanding that if I went to a different species, those numbers would be different. So there's a reason that we spend all of this energy going through meiosis, and it's because when I take those two haploid cells, 23 plus 23, I go through fertilization, I create that diploid zygote, which now has that 46 chromosome number. I go through mitosis, I develop, I become an adult. All right, I still have 46 chromosomes worth of information in every cell in my body, right? Mitosis is to make an exact genetic copy, so 46 to 46. But if I were to just go and make 46 chromosomes in each of my gametes, then I'd be doubling the number to 92 in that next generation. Do it again and I double it again. Do it again and I double it again. And this doesn't really work out very well. If you know anything about Down syndrome, they just have a single extra chromosome, not an entire set, just a single extra chromosome. They have 47 chromosomes instead of 46. Our cells are not evolutionarily designed to handle that extra information. It doesn't know what to do with it. And so when you look at a person who has 46 chromosomes versus somebody with Down syndrome with 47, you can see the physical and developmental differences that exist by just having a single extra chromosome. So to try to do this where I'm duplicating genetic information every single time isn't going to work out well. And so evolution came up with a plan, and I'm putting plan in air quotes here, because remember, there really is no design to this. It just happened to work this way and it worked very efficiently. And so we've converged on this process. Um, but that meiosis cuts that chromosome number in half. So its whole purpose, and what we're going to talk about in this entire section, is how does it take 46 chromosomes in a diploid cell and cut it in half to have a haploid cell so that we can keep that chromosome number consistent every generation rather than trying to double it. So we're back to this idea of sexual versus asexual reproduction. What's the benefit? What's the drawbacks? And remember that there are both benefits and drawbacks to both processes. That's why evolution has kept both of them to exist. So when we finished up mitosis, we talked about asexual reproduction, taking a single cell, duplicating its genes, and dividing, right? Really using mitosis, or in the case of bacteria, going through binary fission in order to do this. But we're creating genetically identical offspring. They're clones to each other, they're clones back to their parents. So the binary fission in bacteria being the very simplistic version of that because they don't have a nucleus, so it's not true mitosis. But then the hydra and the yeast that go through the budding, the planaria and the sea stars through fragmentation, some of the plants that can do the cutting, right? Sexual reproduction is really going to be our focus here because now we're going to take two parents and create those gametes and then allow those gametes to come back together to produce those offspring so that each parent is contributing half of their genetic information to that offspring. As a result, those offspring are genetically different from the parents. We're also going to talk about some really cool features of meiosis that not only allow those offspring to be different from their parents, genetically speaking, but even from the same set of parents, their offspring that they produce are all also genetically different from each other. So even if you take a mom and a dad and they have 5 children, each of those 5 children are not genetically identical to each other either. And it's going to be pretty cool when we start digging into how this works with meiosis, because the amount of genetic variation that comes from sexual reproduction is just astronomical. So we are going to need meiosis in order to produce those gametes, so that those gametes then only contain half of their genetic information to make the offspring. And most of the organisms that kids think about, if I were to ask you to just list 10 organisms off the top of your head from random, right, you probably would more than likely list probably all 10 that are sexually reproducing. So most animals, most plants are kind of cool. Some of them can kind of do both. They can both sexually reproduce and asexually reproduce. Strawberries, for example, can do both. They can create runners, if you've ever watched them reproduce, and those runners are asexually produced. But then they also make flowers to make the strawberry itself, which is the fruit, and the seeds that exist in those strawberries are asexually reproducing. So it's pretty cool. So speaking of the fact that there are different life cycles out there, right? If I go back here, this is the basic life cycle of a human, right? Most of our life cycle is spent as a diploid cell. Most of the cells in our body are diploid, and we're using mitosis to produce them. The gametes only get produced when it's time for fertilization or time for the production of offspring. But not every organism exists that way. This is another alternative, this idea of alternation of generations, where it's one generation is diploid, the next generation is haploid. Ferns are a great example of this. And it exists in a handful of plants. Algae, some protists also go through this alternation, where they alternate between a sporophyte, a diploid phase, which is what we looked at down here. So we'll take that sporophyte, right? It'll go through meiosis, it'll produce spores. Those spores then will go through mitosis to produce the gametophyte, which is the haploid phase, all right? Because it's already haploid as an adult, it will go through mitosis to produce those gametes. Those gametes will come together then via fertilization, make a diploid zygote, just like we saw in humans. The diploid zygote then will go through mitosis to produce the sporophyte, which is diploid, and then that will go through meiosis to produce those spores and keep this going. So you basically have two adult forms, the sporophyte and the gametophyte. And so every other generation, we are back and forth between those haploid and those diploid adult versions, which is pretty cool. All right. Um, Again, I mentioned the ferns. They're a pretty cool example of this. So their sporophyte is the big fronds, the big leafy things, and if you flip it over, you can see the little spore pockets, the little brown dots that are on the back that are producing those spores. And then that little curlicue kind of structure are the gametophytes that produce the gametes, and then we produce the big frondy types again in the next generation. So interesting way to look at it, because we spend so much time talking about what happens in us in humans that sometimes we forget that not every organism on Earth works exactly like us.